Welcome back to another SY3 screencast, and what we're going to look at in this particular video is the theme of anti-politics in a bit more detail. So this, remember, was a theme that we introduced briefly at the end of the last screencast when we were talking about the role of political parties. And the material in this screencast is particularly relevant to any exam questions that address the theme of political participation. Okay, the first thing that I'd like you to do is hit the pause button and just read through the piece of graffiti that you can see on your screen at the moment. And this piece of graffiti obviously expresses a very strong negative outlook towards mainstream political parties and elections. And this type of negative attitude and disengagement from the formal institutions and practices of party politics is what Jerry Stoker calls anti-politics. So there's growing evidence that a key feature of British politics is that large numbers of citizens are completely alienated from its mainstream practices. And there's lots of evidence to support this. So focus group studies have consistently found a very negative attitude of participants to the term politics, which is generally something that they do not feel part of or involved in. And instead, politics is viewed by many people as the pursuit of an exclusive and untrustworthy elite of hypocrites and liars. And a major survey carried out by the Hansard Society in 2010 found that within the UK, roughly 2/3 of citizens could be categorised as falling into the anti-politics camp, in the sense that they were found to be expressing consistently negative views about the formal political processes and governing arrangements of British society. And one clear indicator of this anti-politics mood is this long-term decline in the amount of people turning out to vote in British general elections. So as we can see here, although turnout in the 2010 general election was slightly up compared to 2005 and 2001, it was still only an estimated 65%. And as you can see in this graph, that is far lower than the turnouts achieved throughout most of the post-war period. So in 2010, over 1/3 of the electorate failed to vote, despite the fact that it was a very tightly contested and high-profile election, given an additional boost in public attention by the first ever televised leadership debates. And as we saw at the end of the last screencast, all of the main political parties have seen a significant drop in their membership. So the Conservative Party, if we go back to the 1950s, had a membership of around about 3 million people. So it was a huge mass membership party. But by the end of the last decade, membership of the Conservative Party was less than 250,000 people, a massive decline over time. And we see a similar long-term decline in party membership if we look at the other main parties. So this graph shows the decline in the membership of the Labour Party, and this graph shows exactly the same pattern of decline in relation to the Liberal Democrats. Also, although in contrast to political parties, pressure groups such as Amnesty International, Friends of the Earth, etc., have increased their membership, and there are now a plethora of pressure groups that many people belong to. Many of these have what we call a checkbook membership, and this means that their members hand over funding to these organisations, but generally engage very little in the direct activity of politics itself. Now, this anti-politics mood is not unique to the United Kingdom. We can find evidence of an anti-politics culture throughout most of the mainstream democracies in Europe. For example, in Italy earlier this year, in the elections, the political party that made the biggest breakthrough wasn't one of the established parties, but was in fact a new political party led not by a politician, but by a comedian, this guy that you can see in the picture, Beppe Grillo, who gained a lot of public support for arguing that politicians and government officials needed to have their salaries reduced by 70%, and that this money could then be made available in the form of microcredit for small companies. So this was an expression of an anti-politics movement against the more established political parties, such as the one led by Silvio Berlusconi. And we can also find similar evidence of an anti-politics mood if we look across the Atlantic to the United States of America. So what this graph shows is trust in US politicians, and we can see here that there are now a majority of the public in America who either don't trust their politicians at all or don't trust them very much. And this collapse in trust and confidence in politicians and mainstream political institutions is referred to by Manuel Castells as a crisis of legitimation. And Castells argues that there's evidence of a crisis of legitimation in virtually all established democracies. So in this graph we can see a decline in trust in most of the mainstream European political institutions. And Manuel Castells argues that this crisis of legitimation in established democracies has led to the rise of new social movements often willing to engage in direct action outside of the formal political institutions. So the rise of new social movements such as the Indignados movement and the Occupy Wall Street movement perhaps reflect this crisis of legitimation, this lack of faith in mainstream politicians. And this might suggest that political participation is not necessarily in decline, but that it is changing, with a growing willingness of some members of the population to take direct action outside of the formal political apparatus. Also, although the public have maybe lost faith in mainstream political parties, they're still often engaged in particular issues, single issues, that they feel strongly about. And new technologies, such as the use of e-petitions, makes it easier for people to express their views on a particular issue. Another way in which political participation might be changing rather than declining is the rise in so-called hacktivism. And hacktivism is the use of computers and the internet to promote political ends. And the group that gets the most coverage is a disparate group of hacktivists known as Anonymous, who tried to promote free speech on the internet by attacking governments or corporations that they believe are placing limitations on free speech in that arena. And another way in which political participation might be changing rather than declining is the advent of newer forms of individualized participation, such as ethical consumerism. And this is an issue that's highlighted by Paul Whiteley, who looks at the way in which consumers will often buy particular products because they support the causes or the issues that lie behind them. And the success of the fair trade movement is obviously a good example of ethical consumerism. And as well as actively choosing to buy certain products because we identify with the political views behind the product, people might also engage in boycotts of particular products or services for political reasons. And a really good example of that has been the boycott of the Sun newspaper within the city of Liverpool over the allegations that it made about the Hillsborough disaster. So what I'm trying to argue is that if you get an exam question that implies that political participation is in decline, you shouldn't necessarily assume that people are politically apathetic and disengaged simply because they're not voting or getting involved in party politics. There are now a growing number of choices that people might make about political participation that might lead them to participate in different ways than voting or simply being a member of a political party. So maybe political participation is changing rather than declining.